3 years, 3 weeks since Russia and Ukraine went to war. American President Trump has made it his top agenda to broker a ceasefire between President Putin and Zelensky and negotiate a lasting peace arrangement. Meanwhile, the Polish Prime Minister says that Prime Minister Modi himself spoke and convinced President Putin to desist from using nuclear weapons against Ukraine. In the midst of all of this, global economist Professor Jeffrey Sachs delivered a speech to the European Union Parliament declaring that the Ukraine war is effectively over. Welcome to Times Now, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. Many thanks for speaking to us. And Dr. Sachs, we live in very, very interesting times and uncertain times, may I add. Let me begin by asking you about what you've written on Ukraine earlier this month. In your article on March 6th, titled Negotiating Lasting Peace in Ukraine, you've ruled the missed opportunities in the past to secure a lasting peace arrangement between Russia and Ukraine. You also speak about Istanbul communique of 2022, where Turkey was keen to mediate. Then the Minsk II agreement of 2015 as well, which was not followed up on. Where do we stand today? And do you believe President Zelensky, albeit considerably weakened now, is in a position to still secure favorable terms if he actually goes in for peace?
The story of Ukraine is a tragic story in which the United States led Ukraine on for U.S. purposes for many, many years and got Ukraine into terrible trouble. I think President Trump is trying to end the war now, which could save Ukraine. But this is after a long period of U.S.-led disasters. The main disaster started with the U.S. push for NATO to enlarge to Ukraine, right up to Russia's border. And Russia has been saying for 30 years, keep away from our border. We don't want American military bases on our border. We don't want American missiles minutes away from Moscow. All perfectly understandable. But the United States was so arrogant for so long that it didn't listen. In 2008, the United States pushed NATO to commit to enlarge to Ukraine and to Georgia in the South Caucasus. And this was viewed by Russia as very dangerous, unambiguously so. Now, in 2014, the United States participated in a coup that overthrew a Ukrainian president who favored neutrality. And the government that came in after the coup was a pro-NATO enlargement government. When two of the ethnic Russian regions of eastern Ukraine broke away from the coup, there was negotiated a Minsk agreement, actually Minsk I and Minsk II. Minsk II was endorsed unanimously by the UN Security Council to give autonomy to the ethnic Russian regions of eastern Ukraine. But the United States said to the post-coup government in Ukraine, you don't have to accept that. You should remain a unitary state. And notwithstanding the UN Security Council support for the Minsk II agreement, don't give autonomy. This was another terrible mistake. In the end of 2021, President Putin proposed a new security agreement with the United States, starting with no NATO enlargement to Ukraine. The United States refused to negotiate on that basis. When Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, the Ukrainian government, Mr. Zelensky, immediately said, almost within days, yes, we can be neutral. And on that basis, what's called the Istanbul process, a draft peace agreement was reached on April 15th, 2022. Once again, the United States said to the Ukrainians, you don't have to accept that. You shouldn't accept that. You should fight on. We have your back. So too did the British. and Ukraine walked away from the negotiating table and continued the war. There have been about 1 million casualties on the Ukrainian side since then, dead and seriously wounded. And of course, the battle has not gone well for the Ukrainians. They have lost ground significantly since those early days when they could have had a peace. So all of this is to say, at every step of the way, the United States has given the wrong advice, and it led into this war that never should have happened. Now there needs to be peace.
You're very right when you say that America is not going to fund this war anymore, and the writing's on the wall. But I want to ask you, how do you see the interaction between President Trump and President Zelensky in the United States on February 28th? Diplomacy doesn't often lend itself to such public showdowns. But clearly, President Trump does have a personality that you've not seen before in any world leader. What do you think the exchange really suggested? Did it suggest the end of any indulgence by Americans and the American abandonment of Ukraine, as many are looking at it? How do you see it?
Well, it was very unpleasant to watch because the United States led Ukraine into this trap. And so the ultimate responsibility is American responsibility. But Donald Trump does not want Biden's losing hand. This is the basic point. Remember how Trump kept talking to Zelensky, you have a losing hand, you have a losing hand. In fact, Trump is holding the cards that Biden was playing, if you could put it that way. And the Biden administration was an incompetent administration. It did great damage to Ukraine and I think to American interests and to world interests. And Trump does not want to hold those losing cards. This is the basic point, to use that extended analogy. It was crude. It was nasty. It did not reflect the reality that the U.S. was the underlying cause. But I have to say, Zelensky does not represent Ukraine's interests right now. He rules by martial law. The majority of the people in Ukraine want peace, even with territorial concessions. The young people of Ukraine do not want to die needlessly on the front line, which is what's happening right now. They're being pulled off the streets and sent with insufficient training, leadership, and weaponry to the front line where they're dying. They don't want that. And Zelensky is not the voice of his nation. He is a martial law ruler. So this is a terrible situation. Again, the United States pushed Ukraine into this. I used to say for years, in warning to the Ukrainians, I said, you will become the Afghanistan of Europe. Be careful. I used to quote to them the famous adage of Henry Kissinger, that to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. And that's what I told them.
But Dr. Sachs, how do you think the Russians are viewing all of this? I ask you this because if Zelensky does bite the peace bullet now, doesn't Ukraine stand to lose almost 20% of its territory, including the Donbas region? Do you think Ukraine will need to reconcile with a shrunken Ukraine? As you said, one of the three points of discussion will be the concessions in territory.
Well, they want a peace. They don't want a ceasefire per se. They want a peace agreement. And as I keep emphasizing, the Istanbul draft peace agreement of April 15, 2022 is a perfectly sensible basis for peace. The longer Ukraine holds out, the more territory Ukraine will lose. If they continue to hold out and refuse to negotiate, they'll lose the whole country, in effect. Russia, I believe, will just continue to advance. Peace is in Ukraine's interest. It has been in Ukraine's interest all along. The Ukraine government should not have said they want to join NATO. It was too dangerous. The Ukraine government should have implemented the Minsk agreement. The Ukraine government should have signed the Istanbul draft peace agreement. So these are terrible mistakes, all of them made under the guidance and the reassurance by the United States, which is no guidance of wisdom and no true reassurance at all.
Dr. Sachs, I'm also reminded of an article you wrote for The Economist in 2023. You had said that countries who appear to be neutral in this conflict can help negotiate a lasting peace between the two nations, Russia and Ukraine, and you had mentioned India among them. Do you still see a role for India here? Because India has sought to speak with both sides. Prime Minister Modi has visited both Moscow as well as Kyiv in the past.
I believe that what makes the agreement work is when an agreement is reached. If President Putin were to brazenly violate it, those who are guarantors of the agreement and those who are friendly with Russia would, of course, recoil. And so the mistake in our public discourse is to say, how can we trust Putin? Well, this is what the West says. I know, by the way, how many times the U.S. cheats, so I'm not impressed by that line anyway. But on the question, how does one trust a country to abide by a treaty? It's not a bilateral agreement between Ukraine and Russia. Such an agreement would be a globally understood agreement, such that if one party violated it, it would lead to high costs for the violator because all of the trade partners, the finance partners, the diplomatic partners of that country would recoil. Russia has good relations with India. Russia has good relations with China. But if Russia and Ukraine signed a peace agreement and then Russia just broke the agreement willfully, that would definitely harm relations with India and with China and with others. So that's why I believe treaties make a difference, because it comes at a high cost to violate them. I do believe the right place for a treaty like this starts in the UN Security Council. I might add, I also believe that India should be a permanent member of the UN Security Council. That's a matter for another discussion. But I would like to see India as a permanent member, as the sixth permanent member of the UN Security Council, because of India's place in the world as one of the world's most important countries.
You were in India recently and have supported India's bid for a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. But do you see this aspiration being realized in the near future? Because the 5 permanent members have only provided lip service to the expansion of the United Nations Security Council.
I do. I regard there as being 4 great powers in the world right now. The United States, Russia, China, and India. These are 4 massive economies, 4 nuclear powers, 4 technologically sophisticated countries. These are the 4 great powers of the world. If Europe ever got its act together, it would be a 5th right now. Europe is represented in the Security Council, of course. India, in my view, should have a permanent seat. My own view is that this is feasible. The main blockage is China. But this is China and India are both part of the BRICS. They are both believers in multilateralism. I personally, again, speaking as a completely independent observer, I don't much like the Quad or the idea of the U.S. and India somehow ganging up on China. I don't think that this is good for the world or good for India. I would like China and India to have normal relations and for China to say, yes, you're even bigger, more populous than we are, which is amazing. And yes, we support you for a seat in the UN Security Council. If that happened, if China said, yes, We have good relations with India. We have mutually respectful relations. We have solved our tensions on the border issues. We are engaged in trade. We are co-making the BRICS and so forth. And yes, we support India as the sixth permanent member. It would happen almost immediately. And this is at least what I believe should happen. To my mind, India's seat in the UN Security Council on a permanent basis is very important and positive for the world.
Dr. Sachs, as an economist, how do you see India's current economic trajectory as well as the influence it is able to wield globally, in fact, under Prime Minister Modi?
Well, you know, I'm a big fan of India and a believer that India is in a very rapid and dynamic growth phase. India is growing right now at about 6% per year. I think it could be 7% per year. That would mean a doubling every decade. This is what I'm hoping for and looking for. I believe that excellence of education, science, and technology will be the key for India's continued very rapid growth forward. And I think that this is the Prime Minister's agenda. So I'm very optimistic about India's prospects.
The tariff wars between America, China, Canada, and Mexico, and now the European Union as well, appear to have begun. Trump had threatened reciprocal tariffs with India too amidst negotiations between the two countries for a bilateral trade treaty. Trump appears to have exercised a bit more patience and restraint as far as India is concerned. But you have criticized Trump's approach vis-a-vis tariffs, saying that US will squander its leadership in global development, finance, and trade and lose competitiveness. Is this playing into China's hands? How do you see it?
You know, protectionism is a bad idea. And if you go protectionist, you have the false confidence that your industry is doing okay when actually it's falling further and further behind the rest of the world. So it's a kind of false safety. Look at India during its protectionist era in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. India was a chronically slow-growing and inefficient economy until it began its opening to the world in the 1990s. The same is true with China, which began its opening roughly 10 to 15 years earlier in the late 70s, early 80s. You really make your mettle by competitiveness, and that's by being out there and competing. Now, the United States is breaking its international supply chains. So yes, maybe a little bit more industry will occur in the United States, but it will be high-cost industry. It will not be competitive with China. It will not be competitive with India. It will not be competitive with other leaders in key technologies. And so I think the approach that the U.S. is taking is absolutely self-defeating. Trump believes in tariffs. I do not. I think it's just a strategic mistake.
And how do you look at the Middle East? You have expressed concern that Trump's unlimited backing of Israel could result in a possible escalation in the conflict in the Middle East. Do you believe that amidst a fragile ceasefire so far, the Middle East remains a tinderbox for further escalation and expansion of the conflict?
Yes, the Middle East has two major issues. One is Israel and Palestine, and the second is Iran, because Iran comes into this in a number of ways. But when it comes to Israel and Palestine, there is an obvious overriding solution that is so obvious that it has been endorsed probably dozens of times in UN General Assembly resolutions, in UN Security Council resolutions, in decisions of the International Court of Justice, and in countless other contexts. And that is that there should be two states a state of Palestine and a state of Israel living side by side in peace. And the Arab countries and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation have said repeatedly, if there are two states living side by side on the border of the 4th of June, 1967, with the capital of Palestine in East Jerusalem, there will be normal relations of the Arab world and the Islamic world with Israel. That would be the key to peace.
Sachs, you have frowned upon U.S. bullying, whether it's the kind of language Trump has adopted vis-a-vis Canada as the 51st state, or talking about claiming Greenland and the Panama Canal. Do you believe this can have serious consequences in Trump's current administration itself over the next 4 years?
Well, I think the bullying is not just rhetorical flourish. I think it's real in the president's mind. I think it's hugely wrong-headed. This is something that should be relegated to the past. It never should have happened, but it's 19th century language rather than 21st century language. One of the president's favorite presidents, as he says, is William McKinley, who was president as of January or March 1897. And McKinley was the quintessential imperialist. McKinley cooked up a war with the Spanish Empire, which is why the Philippines became a colony of the United States, why Cuba briefly was a colony of the United States, why Puerto Rico is still a territory of the United States, because that was an imperial war by McKinley. Well, Trump actually takes that view. I don't think it's impossible that he would try to land troops in Greenland, for example, because he looks at the map and he says, Greenland, lots of resources, Arctic access, that should be ours, not Denmark's. This is, of course, as I say, absolutely dangerous, outmoded ideas for the world. But is it real? It is real. It's not just empty threats. I hope it doesn't come to pass. I hope cooler heads prevail. And by the way, were the United States to take any action like that, it would have devastating boomerang effects on the United States. The U.S. is a bully, by the way, in its post-World War II history. It's overthrown dozens and dozens and dozens of governments, covert regime change operations, wars of choice. It is a bully. But to be so brazen as to say, you are mine, I'm taking you, and actually doing it, it would awaken the entire world to the threat of this outmoded way of approaching the world. So I really hope it doesn't come to pass, and I hope that common sense prevails.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, for that very insightful discussion. And I'm sure our audiences in India and across the world would really love to read between the lines in this interview that you've shared. Thank you very much for joining.